Since everyone here is extremely busy, let's move on. I'll make very short couple of minutes introduction. For those of you who are here for the first time, because I see many familiar faces who come here every year, this is the 35th time that we do this in this beautiful hall, not in particular this room, but in many of the Senate rooms. The event is called the U.S.-Russia Forum. Can you hear me? No? Sound is okay? Okay. Yeah, first event started May 21, 1981. And it was dedicated to celebrate the birthday of great physicist, Nobel Prize winner, Peace Nobel Prize winner, Andrei Sakharov. This was his 60th birthday, and he was in exile for speaking out against the Soviet system. And it was so successful. By the way, I even should start with thanking Senator Amy Klobuchar, because to get a room like this for outside group, you need a senator to sponsor the event. And today is Senator Amy Klobuchar, and we want to thank her. Just give her a little applause. But during those 35 years, we had many U.S. senators who did the same. And it was first man was Senator Ted Kennedy, then Senator Bob Dole, Senator DeMint, and now Amy Klobuchar, and many others. So it shows that no matter what relations between two countries, whether good or bad, still there are some people on Capitol Hill who understand that U.S.-Russia relations is a very important factor for U.S., first of all, security, and in general, foreign policy. Unfortunately, our goal that we proclaimed always, that once Russia gets rid of communism and become a free and democratic country, then it should become a natural U.S. ally. And we're working very hard for all those 35 years to do that, and we're up and downs, up and downs. At some point, we thought we almost reached this goal. We know in 91, communism has gone. So at that time we said, well, our job is done, we can just take it easy and just relax a little bit. But didn't work this way. And then another peak up was in 2001 when Russia helped, actually President Putin helped US to defeat Taliban in Afghanistan. At that time, we had maybe a dozen or even more US senators who came here pledging that from now on, US and Russia will be like allies, not just partners, but allies. But then things went south, and today things I don't even recall, even during the Cold War, Soviet days, that relationship was so bad. Well, it's unfortunate. Still, we are trying, and thank you for coming. I think people who came here want to know what, not only who is guilty, or in Russian they say "Kto vinovat," but also what to do, how we can get out of this mess. And this is the reason for this conference. I know that Congressman Dan Auerbach, whom I know from the old Reagan times. So for those who don't know him, I think he has many, many titles, but I think, at least for me, most important title was that he was a Reagan speechwriter. And Ronald Reagan was my hero, so it's my great pleasure to introduce you Congressman Dan Auerbach to say his views, not only who is guilty, but what can be done. Thank you.
Thank you for all you do. This guy does so much, and it's like most people who are trying to do something that really is significant. You don't get thanked while you're alive. I mean, look at Abraham Lincoln. He was the most hated man in America, and now look at the monument they have. And 2 months before, of course, he died, people began changing their opinion of him, but his entire career, he was a hated man. And people who are trying to be peacemakers quite often find themselves getting punched in the nose by both sides. I know that. I did that. I tried to break up a fight when I was younger, and that's exactly what happened to me. I think that when you talk about how we've changed in my entire life until I was 40 years old, actually, until I was probably 41, 42 years old, but mainly 40 years old. First 40 years, there was no doubt in my mind that we would someday have a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. In fact, we all had to hide under the desks because there was going to be a nuclear attack, and we were at each other's throats, Everything we were doing is designed to maneuver against each other and to cause each other great harm. I am very honored, and in my whole life I was honored to play a role with Ronald Reagan, who was, yes, a hardliner, but at the same time dedicated to peace and to cooperation between Russia and the United States, and also an enemy of communism and every other form of tyranny. Something has gone wrong. I mean, something's gone terribly wrong. It's clear that today that the trend line in our relations is working against the benefit of the United States and against the benefit of the people of Russia. And we've got to turn that around for the sake of peace, but also for the sake of the well-being of both of our countries. Edward was just mentioning the situation with how Russia helped us after 9/11. And we shouldn't forget that. It was help that we could not have done without, because we were involved with this Northern strategy, with the Northern Alliance coming down, and with our people being put into action there against the Taliban. We could not have done without the help of Russia. And during those years, immediately after 9/11, they were there to help. And let me just also note that during that time period, there was a school that was blown up by the Chechens in Russia. And Basilean, is that how you pronounce it? Is that the right pronunciation? Basilean?
Bislam.
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 Well, I went down to that school and saw that, where these poor kids had been blown up by radical Muslims. And I remember the day that it happened, and I heard about these hundreds of children, and I called up a very high-level person in our government. And this is after the Russians have been helping us with Afghanistan. And I called up and I said, look, now's our chance to really cement things. We need to have George W. Bush go down to that school and stand shoulder to shoulder with Putin and pledge that the United States and Russia would work together to destroy this evil that was threatening humankind in radical Islam, an evil that would blow up children like this, shoulder to shoulder, and that we pledge ourselves to work together in this battle. And you know what? I won't go into whose name it was, but a very high-level person in the last government there with George W. Bush. And that person said, no way, Dana, that's never going to happen. We missed an enormous opportunity to cement goodwill. And why did we do it? Well, because there are still a lot of people who can't get over the fact that the Cold War is over. And we have some moves that have been made on the Russian part that are not good as well. And so both sides have made mistakes, but it's up to us now to try to get out of this quagmire. That should be our number one goal, is trying to put us back in a situation where we can work together. Why? Because radical Islam has not gotten better since that time when that school was blown up. It's gotten worse. And the fact is, what we have now is an international movement, at an historic level, that could end up in threatening the entire planet. And there is no other greater alliance that would help us defeat radical Islam than if Russia and the United States were working together to do that. And those people who are still trying to find every fault that goes on in Russia, and the Russians that are trying to do everything they can to beat their chest to show that they're big boys, both of those groups are doing a great disservice to both of our countries. We need, on both sides of the equation, we need to reach out and try to find those areas where we can work together. And public statements like we should have made after that school was blown up, make sure we make these public statements. Do you know that after 9/11, most of you know that the Russian people built a wonderful monument right across the water from where those buildings came down, the Twin Towers came. Almost no Americans know about that. Almost no Americans know about that. And that's sad that they don't, because that is one of the most beautiful memorials to the victims of 9/11 that they're around anywhere. And here it was a gift from the Russian people. Well, we need now to overcome some of these things, and we shouldn't be timid about it. It's gonna take all of us working together. Let us note that we did make some mistakes. The American people made some mistakes. The Russian government made some mistakes. After the Cold War, after Russia, then the Soviet Union decided to fundamentally change its direction of its foreign policy and its domestic policy. Did we rush forward to embrace our new friends? No. And I think that that's very well understood, and I think they're resented by many people in Russia that we did not do that. And instead, economically, we not only didn't we rush forward to embrace the Russian people, we in fact put barriers around Russia that damage their ability to provide a level of economic well-being to their own people. And I remember those days very well. For example, what could Russia then get involved in? They say, could you get involved in with Russia and the Western economies, which they were frozen out of? Let me tell you how they were frozen out. In my area, in my district, they make rockets. Delta rockets were made in my district. Well, guess what? The Russians, if you let them get in the marketplace, they would have been competing against the guys who work in those rocket factories in my district. I said, let's do it. Let's make sure the Russians can sell satellite launches. But instead, we forced the Russian government into an agreement that there would be no satellites and transportation, space transportation, for 7 years until 7 years later. After which, all that time, when they should have been interacting with us on an economic basis, on high technology rocket and space transportation, that didn't happen, and they were left out. Multiply that in a number of areas. We did not permit them to get involved, and thus the economy of Russia was hurt when we should have been trying to strengthen the economy so they wouldn't go back to their old days. Now, no wonder there's some resentment then. Well, when there's resentment, people make bad mistakes, and I think that Russia has made some bad mistakes as well. And for example, we all here, we need to talk about what's going on in Ukraine. I think it was a horrible mistake. First of all, I'll agree with you on something else, but let me just note, I think it was a terrible mistake for Russia to send troops into Ukraine. And they claim they haven't, but we all know they have. That actually put a cloud over a situation that we might have been able to handle a little bit better. But we also have to recognize the problem in Ukraine did not start when the Russian troops went into Ukraine. That's not when it started. That has been very damaging to find a solution, but it started when a democratically elected president was overthrown and replaced with someone who wanted to go in a different direction, rather than waiting for the next election for that Yanukovych to be kicked out of office. That is what started this whole snowball in the wrong direction. And thus we have to look at it, however, not who's at fault, who started it, who made it worse by going in with troops, how are we going to get out of this? I think all of us now have to look for a solution, look for a compromise in which nobody is going to be pointing the finger at blame at anybody, and there's a lot of reasons for blame on both sides, like I say, but let's find a solution. Let's find a formula that works for everybody, and that's possible. That's not an impossibility. I'll tell you what's impossible. What's impossible is me going to work for Ronald Reagan, and 9 years later, the Berlin Wall is being taken down. Now, that's impossible. So it is not impossible for us to get out of this and hopefully establish a working relationship when there is conflict in the future, that we can work it out. And let me give you the Rohrabacher peace plan. All right, here's the Rohrabacher peace plan. And it is, number one, Russian troops have to leave. Okay, that's true. I'm okay. Number two, there should be a federal system, and I understand President Putin has already acknowledged that there's these states along the eastern border that are very weary of Kiev, especially after the mayhem that's been going on, should be given a federalist type approach where they get to have their own police and education and things like that. There's nothing wrong with that. We have that in the United States. So that federal system, let them control, but they're still part of Ukraine, and I believe that was something that would satisfy them and satisfy all the concerned. In terms of what happens in Crimea, let me just say this, that I am a Republican. I am not a monarch. Okay? I don't want to go back to the days of monarchy to determine what are legitimate borders and who is in what country. What I believe in is popular sovereignty. I think that's what the United States was all about, meaning government is only legitimate when it has the consent of the governed. So let's let the people in Crimea have an honest election, and there is every reason to say the last election was not done in a way that it will be a legitimate election anywhere. Let's bring in the OSCE, and let's have a very monitored election, and if the people of Crimea want to be Russian, they can be Russian. If they want to be Ukrainian, they can be Ukrainian. I think as long as Putin understands that that even if the people vote to be part of Ukraine, that there would still be a respect for that lease on the naval base down there, I think he might accept that. So here we got a wide area there that I believe is something we can all work together on. I don't know anybody who's talking right now to our Russian friends or our Russian enemies, either one, to find out what's acceptable and what can we do. Where's the formula? What are we negotiating? Where are we negotiating down from? It behooves us to work at it. It behooves the Russians to work at it and for us to work at it. If we had the Russian support right now in the Middle East, and as we faced this radical Islamic assault on the West, we would be so much stronger. Both of our countries and both of our peoples would be so much safer if we were working together rather than looking at ourselves as enemies. And so I would ask all of you, number one, try to have an open mind, try to understand that yes, both sides have made mistakes, and both sides have their faults, and I know a lot of people over here want to blame everything on Putin, and they give him every single thing. They will take the definition of, well, the worst possible analysis is what was at play here. Putin is a mean, vicious villain person. Well, he's certainly not perfect, and we know that. But he's not guilty of everything they charge, because everything that is being everything that can be looked at in a negative way, that's the way these people look at it. No, we're going to have to say both sides have made mistakes. Both sides need to be honest with one another. And I think that we can, because it behooves us, it's so valuable a relationship. If we get over this hump, I believe that we can do it. And I think that Ronald Reagan had that same sort of move forward with a good spirit, be strong in your negotiations, yes, but but make sure you treat people in a good way, and maybe we can make up for some lost ground, realizing that radical Islam is on the move, and we need to work with each other. I thank you very much, Edward, for providing me this forum.
Thank you.
I have a plane at 5 o'clock at Dulles, so whatever it means when I have to run out.
Just maybe 2 minutes until
All right.
your partner. Well, I wish that we had more members of Congress like Dana. Unfortunately, there are not too many. We met recently at the dinner.
Hold on, Edward.
Yeah.
I've got to make one point.
Okay, go ahead.
This is a very important point. Look, I voted against providing weapons to Ukraine. All right, now, look, but that doesn't mean that I thought that Ukraine was all wrong, because I say with the Russians coming in that eastern part, I don't think the troops should have come in. But putting more weapons into a situation where people are killing each other is not going to make it better. I thought that adding more weapons to this situation was like saying we're going to put out the fire by dumping a bunch of gasoline onto it. So we don't need to bring more weapons. What we need is to have more offensive diplomatically in terms of reaching out and finding some solutions. So there you go.
Well, as I said, that I wish we had more people. We had a dinner with Dana a few months ago and asked him, how many people on Capitol Hill think like you? And he smiled, he said, 5. Well, it turned out that in December it was 10, because when the first resolution to vote to provide arms to Ukraine, 10 people voted against it. Now, good news is that a couple of days ago, there was another vote, even more aggressive, to provide even more, even lethal arms. And already 48 members of Congress voted against. So we see some progress. Now, from 10 to 48, it's almost 5 times. So it's what, 500%? It's still a small fraction. But you know what? I also checked the rating of US Congress. You all can easily do it. And the latest I checked was 8%. So only 8% of American people support what Congress is doing. And I know that 8% is Dana and all those people who vote like him. So anyway, we have an answer. Unfortunately, Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak was called for some kind of emergency meeting to New York, but his deputy, Charge d'Affaires, Oleg Burmistrov, will say a few words on the Russian side. Please, Oleg.
Thank you. In the first words, I must confirm that I am not ambassador. My name is not Kislyak, but I'm his deputy. Yes, and Sergei Ivanovich is now on his way to New York, preparing to dot the I's and cross the T's on a three-day marathon discussions initiated and organized as well, excellently organized by Professor Edward Lazansky. Thank you, Congressman. Thank you. I wanted just to remind you that he is among few on the Hill who not only understand the importance of maintaining good relationship with Russia, but doing real things in this direction. Maybe he is only one on the Hill who visited Russia, talked to Russians, communicated to Russians during the last couple of years. And thank you, Congressman. And to my mind, there is no sense to spend time, at least for me, describing the current situation in our relationship. Everybody here are well aware of this situation. And as well as I don't see any no practical reasons to explain to each other, as Edward and Congressman mentioned, to explain to each other who is right and who is wrong in this or that situation, Russia or the United States. I agree with Edward and see two major goals of today's discussion. First is to try to look at the roots of today's contradictions. And the second one, as Edward said, try to find the ways out of all this, if it is possible. I must say that our relationship between Russia and the United States has always been fragile and fragmentary during all modern history. We tried to, but we didn't manage to create an economic safety net in our relations. Our dialogue was, of course, important. We had two major nuclear powers and so on. But our dialogue was limited just with numerous topics of international agenda. And as a result, every time we when we were not able to agree on how to deal with some regional crisis, our bilateral relations suffered as it happened last time with so-called reset reset structures, which were just has been dismantled at the moment. And why it happens from time to time in our relationship? From one side, we don't have any fundamental ideologic divides. We share common values of democracy and market economy, and I think you will agree that Russia is not less democratic than today's Ukraine, for example, or let's say Saudi Arabia. So we share the same values in this sphere. But from the other side, we are very different. First of all, culturologically and mentally, and we must admit it. Differences between us lay in mentality, in culture, in history and traditions. I can give you a couple of examples. Maybe they sound not good, but let's say that if I want to buy Mein Kampf in the United States, will I meet any difficulties in fulfilling my desire? I think no. It's very simple here. Is it possible in Russia? I think not, or almost not. Russia always officially protests against Waffen-SS marches and parades in Baltic states. Does America do the same thing? No. Last example, Western leaders, not all international community, it's a bit different, but Western leaders refused to arrive in Moscow to commemorate the memory of millions who laid their lives on the altar of victory over Nazis. I think that I want to ask, do they understand that with this politically motivated decision, they reached only one goal? They damaged their own image in the eyes of the whole people of Russia, our country. And so far, so on. Of course, I give examples only from the Russian side. My American colleagues, of course, can add, can strike back, and give some other examples how Russians cannot understand Americans. One more. Maybe Americans consider Russian society as too traditional, too over-traditional. But sometimes Russians are not able to keep pace with some American innovations in social sphere. Imagine that if a few decades ago, Secretary General Brezhnev, for example, declared a right for gay marriages or free use of so-called like drugs. I think many of Americans or of you, of your parents that time could say, oh God, those commies gone mad, it's inappropriate, and so on. But times change and values change. Now Russians are a bit surprised of, maybe not, but majority of Russians, a bit surprised how rapidly those values change. I would call them these values current or up to the moment values. And not everybody is ready to accept it. There are some examples. But the fact is that we sometimes feel each other very well, and sometimes we don't feel each other at all. And that's the key problem. And at the same time, this difference, at the same time, here we can try to find an answer to answer what we should do further. And the recipe is simple, I think. Listening each other, meeting with each other, talking to each other, visiting, treating each other as equals. We insist that we are equal. We insist that we have our own interests. We insist that we have our own peculiarities. We don't like when someone interferes in our domestic affairs. When I say we, I mean not only Russia, I mean both Russia and the United States. And we don't want to close the door, we remain open. Maybe it sounds primitive and naive, what I'm talking about, but sometimes we should recall on this. And Ukrainian crisis must only help us to come back to simple things. Communications. Communicate is what both sides need now, especially now. Attempts of isolation, unwillingness to talk, to hear, to understand a partner will lead to the opposite results, dangerous results. And that's what I wanted just to raise in my speech, and I want to thank at the end again Edward and then Clara Bacha, who is a good friend of our country. Thank you.
Okay, now we'll hear some scholars. Steve Cohen, please. Phil Doctorow, please take your seats. Well, we are fortunate to have three distinguished scholars and take a seat. Representing the top, U.S. universities, and I think that we will save time for introductions because they're just people that are pretty well known. Also, you saw the website. So let's straight to the point, just to save time, and so we can have more time for questions and answers. So first speaker is a distinguished scholar, one of the best scholars of Russian history, Steve Cohen, and he is professor at New York University in Princeton. He has different opinion from most of the mainstream media on what's going on, so it's interesting to hear what he has to say. Please.
I don't think Ed should have to put these things out himself. And the reason is that we all owe Edward Lozanski, an enormous debt of gratitude. So far as I know, in the United States today, there's probably someplace I overlooked. This kind of critical discussion of American policy and U.S.-Russian relations does not take place. And Ed does this forum, this particular one. He has other events once a year. And therefore, it's not only unique, it's important. So thanks, Ed. And we'll try not to embarrass you. I spoke here. Ed moved up the forum this year. I was going to say a year ago, but it was in June last year, 9 months ago. And I warned the following. This was in June 2014, that the Ukrainian crisis is the worst American-Russian confrontation in many decades, not just since the end of the Cold War, as the press will have it, that it has plunged us into a new, some people would say renewed, that's a debate for academics, Cold War with Russia, which I think, for reasons I spelled out last time and won't repeat today, a Cold War that might be, probably will be, if it continues, more dangerous than the preceding Cold War, the one that my generation survived. I also said 9 months ago that we were getting close to actual war, hot war with Russia, and that we hadn't been this close since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. That's the reference point in my mind. I regret to say, because I don't mind being wrong about things like that I was right. And still worse, everything has gotten worse in the last 9 months. The new Cold War has been deepened and institutionalized. Sanctions institutionalized it. Turning the Ukrainian Civil War into a proxy American-Russian war institutionalized the new Cold War. Still worse, both sides are doing what they did. I look at it, the young officers here, they have no memory of this, but they undoubtedly studied it. That the militaries of both sides are aggressively redeploying, as we talk, their conventional and strategic weapons in ways that could lead to accidental confrontation. This too happened during the previous Cold War. Meanwhile, diplomacy between Washington and Moscow has been displaced by another Cold War phenomenon, militarized thinking about politics. Militarized thinking about politics leads to the end of politics and the beginning of war. That's what we're witnessing now. And as a result, in some ways this is the saddest for my generation, that dozens of American-Russian cooperative relations that were created over decades, going back to the 60s, and nurtured, are now being shredded on both sides. It's not just the West. The Russians are shredding them too. They ended, for example, former Senator Bradley's wonderful program that brought thousands and thousands of young Russians here to live in America for a year and study. Ended like that after 25 years of struggle by Senator Bradley to make this a reality. And yet, despite all this and these unprecedented dangers, there is no debate here in Washington. The congressman, and he takes a position more emphatic than the other 47 who voted on Monday against, who were mainly, by the way, Democrats, organized by the Black Caucus, by the senior member of the House, Congressman John Conyers of Michigan, brought out his people to vote against that. So we see Republicans and Democrats joining on this crucial issue. That's good. But there is one, as you know, fragile hope. All of you know that Chancellor Merkel of Germany, President Hollande of France, brokered in Minsk in February an agreement with Russian President Putin and Ukrainian President Poroshenko, a ceasefire. And the ceasefire was only step one. That was supposed to lead to a set of political acts on both sides that would end the Ukrainian civil war through negotiation and end this crisis. That's good. The bad news is Washington is against it. Brussels is against it. Congress, members of the Obama administration, certainly the think tanks, the American media are trying to sabotage Minsk. They call Merkel an appeaser. Obama seems to have told Merkel, I'll give you some time to make this work. Then I'll send $1 billion worth of weapons to Kiev a year for the next 3 years, as Congress has approved. So much hangs in the balance. What do we say about this today? My first impulse was to use my time to say why I think it's not Russia's aggression or the demon Putin that's responsible for this worst crisis of our time, but American policy since the 1990s. I've written books about this. I spoke about it last time. I don't feel the need to explain why I think that again here today. If you're interested in how I apply that historical analysis to the Ukrainian crisis, you can go to thenation.com. My articles from since the crisis began are posted there. I want to talk instead about something else. I want to be perhaps quixotic. I like Don Quixote. My wife, Katrina vanden Heuvel, and I were in Cuba 2 years ago, and the only thing we brought back as a souvenir was a terrific etching of Don Quixote. I look at it every day and think, well, that's trying to deal with Washington on Russia. But let me ask this question. Let's say somehow we get past the Ukrainian crisis. We'll still be in a new Cold War with Russia. It's not going to end. Damage is done. What do we do to control and shorten this new Cold War? And the answer is we have to enact a new détente. Now, whether the younger people here in the audience, I'm not picking on you, it's not your fault, you're young. It's not my fault I'm old. It's just that I lived through things you didn't. I'm not sure they know what détente was. But détente was, for 30 years or more, the struggle in this country and in Moscow to control the last Cold War. Simply defined, détente as an idea and as a policy meant expanding the elements of cooperation in American, Soviet as it was, Cold War relations, and shrinking the areas of conflict in order to make it less dangerous. None of us who were in that struggle thought we could end the Cold War. There were utopians who said we got to end the Cold War. We just wanted to make it less dangerous because of the nuclear risks. Now, the history of détente is important today. It had a very long, very embattled, often defeated history. Technically, the first détente occurred in 1933, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt, after 15 years of American non-recognition, recognized Soviet Russia. That had been the first Cold War. But in the modern day, détente began under Eisenhower and Khrushchev, the spirit of Camp David, and it was quickly ended, some say sabotaged, don't know, by Cold War forces and events. And that pattern continued for the next 30 years. There was a striving toward détente after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 by Kennedy. Khrushchev reacted. Kennedy was assassinated. The Vietnam War came. Détente took second place. But under Nixon, as you all know, there was the most ambitious attempt. It was Kissinger's design to create a kind of institutionalized détente, a lot of treaties, a lot of summits. Nixon and Brezhnev actually liked each other. One can see why. And it looked like maybe we, the détentists, would prevail. But it too was undone by events. There were a lot of them. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan certainly didn't help. The Jewish immigration question was a big problem. And then there was a period where Carter tried a little, and then Reagan became president. And we all thought that's, not all of us, but people said that's the end of détente. This is the most Cold War president in American history, rhetorically. But he had thoughts, Reagan did, private thoughts. And suddenly, or not so suddenly, in 1985, President Reagan, with the new Soviet leader Gorbachev, began a détente so far-reaching that those two leaders and Reagan's successor, the first President Bush, thought at the time and said repeatedly in 1988, 1989, 1990, I was there, I worked for CBS News, I saw all these events firsthand. All of them said, we ended the Cold War. Cold War's over. Reagan said it, Gorbachev said it, Bush said it. And that was a kind of victory of our struggle for détente. Why, you have to ask, because this brings us to the present day. Did the idea of détente and the advocacy of détente survive for 30 years in the United States, despite all the times it was defeated, and defeated badly? And there is an answer that takes us not only to today, but to the Ukrainian crisis. The reason is that the détente flourished because at the basis of détente thinking was a conception of what was called then parity. I think in Russian it's paritet или paritetnost. Paritet. Parity. Parity between the United States and the Soviet Union. This became the conceptual basis of détente, particularly when it became government policy. Now, it's true, it did not mean moral equivalence, and there was a lot of angry arguments. We obviously couldn't equate ourselves with a communist system, and they couldn't equate themselves with us. But it was a recognition of the single most important thing, that the Soviet Union had become a great power, comparable in its rights at home and abroad to those of the United States. Without that, there could not have been all the arms control agreements, couldn't have been the Helsinki Accords of 1975, it couldn't have been all those summits, couldn't have been these triumphs of détente, unless the United States political class recognized the Soviet Union's legitimacy. And it began, of course, as nuclear parity, mutually assured destruction. But it grew into a political recognition, as in the popular discourse formulated as the two superpowers. Not the two nuclear superpowers, but it became simply the two superpowers. Parity, détente, had many components, but I want to emphasize three because they relate to the situation today. It meant that both sides, the United States and Soviet Russia, had legitimate spheres of influence. This has become a dirty word in Washington. But each had legitimate spheres of influence. I would prefer to call them zones of national security, to distinguish them from traditional 19th century spheres of influence. Let's say red lines, to use the term of Medvedev and Putin, that the other would not cross. There were mistakes, there were violations, there were testings of this understanding, but generally it prevailed. The second conception was that neither side should intervene or interfere in the other side's domestic politics. This too was violated on occasion, but generally speaking, it prevailed. To bring it up to date, there was no talk of regime change in Moscow coming out of Washington, as there is today. And third, that Washington and Moscow had a shared responsibility for world order, peace, and security in the main arenas of world politics. Elsewhere in Africa and the Third World, they could compete all they wanted, through proxies, however they wanted to do it. But in Europe and other main areas, that they were responsible jointly for maintaining security. These tenets of parity prevented a hot war during the last Cold War. And they were the underlying bases of everything that détente achieved, and I think it was the forerunner. It made possible, in some ways, the breakthrough accomplished by Reagan and Gorbachev after 1995. We are in a new Cold War, and I come to my point now, and in the Ukrainian crisis today, largely because Washington discarded the concept of parity. We know when, why, and how this happened. The three leaders who negotiated the end of the Cold War, Gorbachev, Reagan, and the first President Bush, all said at the time, 1988 to 1990, that they had ended the Cold War, and I quote, without any losers, only with winners. Everybody won, nobody lost. But when the Soviet Union ended 2 years later, Washington conflated these two events, the end of the Cold War and the end of the Soviet Union. And very quickly, in January 1992, President Bush, running for re-election, announced that the United States had won the Cold War, and moreover, that there was, and I quote Bush, January 1992, one sole and preeminent power in the world, the United States of America. And this notion that we are alone in the world, however melancholy we may be, as the only superpower and as the indispensable nation, has guided the foreign policy ever since Bush. So what did Obama tell the West Point cadets? You guys were not there, I trust. In, what was it, just last May? The United States is and remains the one indispensable nation. Well, the United States is indispensable to us Americans, of course it is. But how is this heard by other great powers? And this is what I have called since the 90s, American triumphalism, that grew out of the events around the end of the Soviet Union. It's what we teach our children today, it's what we teach our students. It is rarely, if ever, questioned by a leading American political figure or pundit. It is a bipartisan orthodoxy. What it has meant for U.S. policy toward Russia since the 1990s, and which led us to this Ukrainian crisis, is clear. For nearly 25 years, Washington has treated post-Soviet Russia as a defeated nation. They don't say it, but they are thinking analogously with Japan and Germany after World War II, that the most Russia can aspire to is to be a junior partner of American foreign policy and associate itself with America's perceived interests abroad. This is anti-parity, of course. And this anti-parity axiom has shaped every U.S. policy toward Moscow ever since, from the expansion of NATO to Russia's borders, the non-reciprocal negotiations that Washington calls selective cooperations. Moscow gives and we take, and thank you very much. Dozens of examples. The broken promises made by American politicians to Russian leaders. Both Medvedev and Putin have called them deceit and betrayal. Those are harsh, bitter words, long before the Ukrainian crisis. Washington's general double standard: we do one thing, it's good. Russia does exactly the same thing, it's aggression. This grows out of this concept there is no parity. And of course, our constant meddling in Russia's internal affairs, a right we have arrogated to ourselves. Here maybe is the quintessential example. Every American political leader has said, at least since Putin came to power, Russia must never be permitted any sphere of influence. This is a favorite expression of the Vice President, Biden. Russia can't have a sphere of influence. And they say this while the United States is expanding its own military alliance, NATO, all the way to Russia's borders. Someone's calculated that this is the greatest, fastest expansion of a sphere of influence in history in peacetime. Approximately 400,000 square miles. Our sphere of influence has grown, but Russia doesn't get one. Unless, of course, it joins ours. I mean, this, you see, is the anomaly. This is the double standard. This is the underlying conflict. This is why, when you abandon any concept of parity, you're headed into this kind of fundamental conflict. So I think, and I come toward the end, that unless détente and its necessary component, parity, are reenacted, the new Cold War will go worse. Probably it will last decades, so our kids and grandkids get it, as we did, and along with it, the constant danger of a hot war with Russia. I think, therefore, that every sensible, patriotic American, obviously, I don't speak for the Russians in the room, I speak only for myself, but I'm trying to speak to other Americans, must support this mission of reenacting détente. Time's not on our hands, on our side, but reason is, and there will be intense opposition. So here's what we say to those who oppose us in the United States. They say this is appeasement. We hear this every day. And the answer is no, it's patriotism, because American national security in dozens of ways runs through Moscow. Without a full partner in the Kremlin, there cannot be real American national security. And you can begin this discussion wherever you want. Nuclear proliferation, energy, terrorism, take your pick. To those who say Washington must never negotiate with the demon, Putin, we have to say that this vilification of a Russian leader is without precedent in history. We never vilified communist leaders like that, never. That this is an illness that resides in America, not in Putin, that it is without fact and totally without logic. Or does somebody really think that Putin said, I'm going to kill Boris Nemtsov so I can watch it out of my Kremlin window on the bridge, and everybody will know I did it, right at the very moment that what I want to happen in Ukraine, a negotiated settlement, has just been agreed upon? I mean, if Putin had such a notion, he should be in a madhouse, not in the Kremlin. And all the people who actually wrote during that period that that's exactly what happened, most of them in the United States, should be in a madhouse, not in the State Department, not writing editorials for our major newspapers. There is no logic to this. But the demonization of Putin has become an institution in America, a political institution. We can't discuss Russia. We can't discuss our policy. We can't analyze anything, but it all comes down to Putin. To those triumphalists who say Russia is not entitled to a zone of security on its own borders, which would include Ukraine and Georgia. I mention Georgia because NATO is on the move there as we talk again. The answer is, well, if Russia cannot have zones of security on its border, which means free of foreign military power, why is it that the United States insists that not only for Canada and Mexico, but the entire Western Hemisphere in the form of the Monroe Doctrine? How do we explain this lack of parity in this regard? There is no explanation. To those who say because Russia lost the previous Cold War, we then simply have a history lesson and explain to them what really happened during those years. And to those who insist that the United States simply must, because of our virtue, pursue democracy promotion and even regime change in Russia, I suggest we say exactly what I wrote in a testimony to a Senate hearing. I am no longer invited, in 1977, almost 40 years ago. And I wrote this: we, meaning the United States, do not have the wisdom or the power or the right to try directly to shape change inside what was then the Soviet Union. Any foreign government that tries to do this will do itself and Russia more harm than good. I went on to add that if the United States really wants to promote progressive change inside Russia, there is only one way: to help create an international atmosphere of declining conflict and tensions, so that reformers and progressives inside Russia have a chance, and that the United States can do that only through détente. I end with a Russian proverb, Slovo тоже дело. Words are also deeds, and it's true, but it's also true that we need to organize. And I'm hoping that my colleague, Gilbert Doctorow, who's come from Brussels with his American passport, however, will say a few words about that today. Thank you.
Okay, just a couple of comments. When Steve said that Putin is ultimate evil, and as soon as he gone or regime change, then everything will be fine. So, but let's look at what happened in the 90s. At that time, the same Boris Nemtsov was number 2 or number 3 man in the government. Boris Yeltsin was as a good Democrat, at least best friend of Bill Clinton. And foreign minister of Russia was doing exactly what Washington tells them to do. And still, NATO started expanding exactly at that time. Then came Medvedev, also a good guy who could work with Obama. And we started this reset. And Medvedev was basically pleading, please, Russia wants to be part of European home, European security infrastructure. I don't know how many, probably ambassador would know how many memos were sent to that. It was dismissed, and NATO continued to expand. So it's not Putin, it's something else, which I think Steve was saying. In any event, I think our next speaker will follow up, and probably more on what can we do, and this is Gil Doctorow, please. He came all the way from Brussels, so from another evil town. You know?
Thank you, Ed. I look around and I see a lot of grim faces. Well, that's all to the good because the subject is grim and deserving of a lot of reflection. I don't say that I come here with good news, but in a way, yes. I have two types of news that I think can lighten the burden a little bit. Firstly, we have not brought this on by ourselves. In the opening remarks, you heard about the presentation of the Crimea crisis and the crisis in relations at the international level as a US-Russian issue. I'm sorry, there are other players. We do have a multilateral world even today. And Europe has done its bit to make this mess. Living in Europe, I see that rather close up, and I want to use my speech today to share with you some of my insights as gathered in Brussels, where I live, but also in Berlin, which is the preponderant weight of European decision-making today. The second piece of good news is with respect to détente as a policy, and now I make reference to Steve's remarks. I make reference also to my previous appearance at the last forum, which Ed kindly invited me to in Moscow last September. And my speech at that platform was about the need to recreate an entity called the Committee on East-West Accord, which had been the premier platform for Nixon's détente from 1974 to 1992. I can tell you with pleasure that that mission, which was unanimously backed by the participants in Ed's forum in September, that mission has been realized. On the 25th of February this year, a American Committee for East-West Accord Limited was incorporated in the state of New York as an educational corporation, a nonprofit. We are going to have a rollout or a launch of that later this spring. But I anticipated that event together with my colleagues and had already a kind of rollout in Brussels, which I'll talk about in a second. But now the formal issue, who is on that committee and where is it headed? The committee has 5 directors so far. Two of them are former US ambassadors. The president of the committee is one of those former ambassadors. It is William van der Heuvel. The second ex-ambassador, who is a name that many of you will immediately recognize, that is Jack Matlock. And a major figure in US industry, the 40-year chairman of Procter & Gamble, John Pepper, is another director. 2 of the remaining directors are here on the stage now, Stephen Cohn and myself. My function within this committee is European coordinator. And in that capacity, I had the pleasure of organizing a roundtable entitled Defining a New Security Architecture for Europe that Brings Russia in from the Cold. That took place in the Press Club of Brussels on the 2nd of March. The key speakers were, 2 of them are here today. They are Katrina van den Heuvel and Stephen Cohen. The third was Professor John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago. That very prestigious panel, which was quite unusual, quite rare in its quality for little Brussels, drew a VIP audience, which included 5 members of the European Parliament, a couple of ambassadors and several other high diplomatic officers, heads of think tanks in Brussels, and it was recorded on video, is available for viewing on YouTube if you just type in East-West Accord. I hope you'll do that. The proceedings are quite interesting, both for the presentations of the key speakers and for the Q&A by the distinguished VIP guests. Now, if I can pick up from that point, from the 2nd of March, we had this roundtable. I then accompanied John Mearsheimer 2 days later to Berlin for some high-level meetings at the Bundestag. We met with a number of deputies arranged by Die Linke. That is the far left organization outside the government, both at the federal level, but inside the government and coalitions at several states, the Länder in Germany. We met with, I met separately then with some think tank leaders, advisors to the coalition partners, Social Democrats. And what I'm about to share with you now was gathered largely at these meetings and my correspondence with the individuals, and is to be further examined and explored in the weeks and months ahead, because Germany is certainly deserving all the attention and critical attention it can get, and which it has not received, sadly, in the US and elsewhere. I'll get into that in a moment. The notion of Germany's new assertiveness has been disseminated in US media, but it's based on one factor only: Germany's pocketbook. You have been following, perhaps, the travails of Greece, the visit of its Prime Minister Tsipras to Angela Merkel last week. You are aware that Germany has been the toughest in negotiations with Greece, and its weight has been used in the review by the Troika and elsewhere within the EU institutions to hold in place an austerity program which Germany largely dictated on the rest of Europe going back to the start of the 2008 crisis. So this angle that Germany is very powerful because it is the banker of Europe and can throw its weight around, that you would be aware of from the US press. What you might not be aware of is that Germany also happens to have control of all of the levers of power in the European Union institutions. These facts you would come on in isolation, you wouldn't see them as a constellation. So let me just lay it out for you right now. We have a new, looking at the executive, and the European structure is rather complex. We have two executive bodies. The most important one is the European, well, they can debate this, the European Commission. That has a new chairman, and its chairman, Juncker, was the former prime minister for a good long time in the tiny state of Luxembourg. He was put in place by Angela Merkel. The logic for this was that he is an outstanding figure within the parliamentary majority, or the single largest party of the European Parliament, following the elections of the spring of 2014. And indeed, he is a member of the European People's Party, or EPP. The largest component in that EPP happens to be Angela Merkel's party, the CDU, the Christian Democrats. She put him in place, and no sooner was he named than he fell into a very nasty scandal in which it turned out that this figure of great probity, who had managed the Eurozone for more than a decade, was charged with bending the rules on financial benefits to companies setting up shop or using Luxembourg as a base. That was quite a scandal. It was put out, but it means that he's damaged goods, and as damaged goods, he is very much in the pocket of his patron, Angela Merkel. The other executive body is the European Council, which is the session of the 28 heads of government or heads of state of the European member states. It also has a president. The president was newly appointed, and he happens to be Donald Tusk. Donald Tusk was rather a non-entity outside of his home country of Poland. He was the prime minister of Poland before he was named to this post. He was ridiculed in the press for not having the main quality of the position, which is a communicating position. It's a PR position. That is, he didn't speak English, or hardly. What the press overlooked is that he speaks very good German. The European Parliament. The European Parliament is headed by a German in Angela Merkel's party. This is Martin Schulz. But more relevant to our discussion today, we're talking about foreign affairs in Ukraine, is that the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the European Parliament is another German from Angela Merkel's party. This is Elmar Brok. Brok could very well be on the staff of Poroshenko's government. He is uniformly pro-Kiev and a Russian basher. We have 750 seats in the European Parliament. 500 of them are divided between center-right and center-left. Center-right being slightly larger. The center-right, as I just indicated to you, is controlled by Angela Merkel. So through a leverage principle, Merkel actually has a say on the legislative agenda, or more than a say, she controls the legislative agenda and the outcome of much of the activity of the European Parliament. Foreign policy is in that same kind of bipartisan backing that we have here in the States, which means it's not debated very much within the European Parliament. Now, what has been the policy then on Russia and Ukraine within Angela Merkel's Germany, which presently holds the EU in its thrall? If we go back to the very start of the Ukraine crisis 1 year ago, when reunification or annexation by Russia, depending on your point of view, first came up and created what is now called the New Cold War, Angela Merkel was named by the US and by West European mainstream media as the best possible mediator between East and West. As an Aussie, an East German, a fluent Russian speaker, she would, everyone agreed, be the ideal person to find common understanding with Vladimir Putin and calm things down. Moreover, she had at her side in the coalition government which rules in the federal level in Germany, she had a social democrat, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, who was here in Washington a couple of weeks ago. And he was a presumed continuator of his Social Democratic Party's Ostpolitik, or Policy for the East, which goes back to Willy Brandt and runs through Gerhard Schroeder. It meant there was a long record of accommodation with Russia, which, if anything, had long raised suspicions in France and the United States as being too cozy with the Russians. In any case, what seemed like the premises for Germany, the honest broker, were in place. However, as the spring turned to summer and summer turned to autumn, we found a whole succession of increasingly severe sanctions imposed by the EU, driven by Angela Merkel, who rode herd over the 27 other members of the EU and ensured that there were no abstentions and there was no contradiction to what she decided was the consensus view of Europe. This appeared to be run counter to domestic German political calculus, given that, as everyone knew, the German economy had never fully recovered from the crisis of 2008 and might easily slip into a double dip into recession. Sanctions on Russia brought counter sanctions and counter measures that were harmful to German exports, and the very damage done to the Russian economy, its slowdown, was also impairing German exports to Russia. 300,000 German jobs were said to be on the line, dependent on the Russian market. By December 2014, German business associations issued public statements denouncing the sanctions policy, and Merkel was the butt of a fiery speech in the Bundestag in early December by a deputy leader of the left opposition, Die Linke, a certain Sahra Wagenknecht, who accused her of selling out German interests through subservience to policies on Russia that were made in Washington. Meanwhile, it turned out that Mr. Steinmeier is an unusually weak member of the coalition. As they now joke in the Bundestag, he is, quote, also informed, quote, about the latest policy on Russia and Ukraine. His position might be compared to John Kerry's at State. Policy on Russia and Ukraine is being made in the immediate entourage of the Chancellor, and her party, the CDU, traditionally had no particular solutions for dealing with Russia. Its orientation, going back to Konrad Adenauer, was always directed at Washington. The Putin-Versteher wing of Steinmeier's party, the Versteher are the ones who try to understand Russia's position, were caught out. They were wrong-footed by the muscle flexing of Russia after the Crimean Spring, and they were easily silenced by stridently anti-Russian media in Germany. It's not just in the States that we have a Fox News. Germany was doing quite well on its own, and there was a Russophobe conformism that settled in Germany, and which my social democrat interlocutors, who've been around a bit and had some experience, insisted they had never before seen in Germany, even in the worst days of the Cold War. Now, these inconsistencies remained unexplored by commentators in the United States, in Europe, and even in the most interested party in the whole question, in Russia itself. Indeed, in Russia, there was a residual conviction among most observers that Germany was their advocate within the EU. Ignoring where Germany really stood lasted until February 2015, when the Chancellor set off in yet another direction. It seemed to contradict completely the notion of subservience to Washington. At that time, in the midst of what was now all-out civil war in Donbass, with insurgent forces freeing the Donetsk airport and extending their territory under their command, the question of the Balsava cauldron came up. The 6,000 to 8,000 Ukrainian troops that were surrounded by insurgents. In the United States, a hue and cry went up. The United States had to rush in and deliver lethal military supplies to Kiev. Angela Merkel took alarm, not over the fate of Poroshenko's government, but over the possibility of further escalation of the conflict as a direct consequence of US arms to Kiev. And the consequences of that, she understood at once, were unforeseeable. She then began her spectacular shuttle diplomacy with French President Francois Hollande in tow. They visited Kiev, Moscow, Minsk. They saw through the negotiations in Minsk to February 12th. While this was going on, or just you had in the interim, a week before, you had already this Munich Security Conference at which the Germans' plans to intervene and cool things off was denounced publicly by those in the American delegation, and already set the tone for what was going to happen on Merkel's visit to Washington in the week following the Minsk II Accords. As you know, she was denounced here by Hawkson as having lost her reason, and we saw the onset of the worst breach in U.S.-European, well, it's U.S.-German, but in the bigger picture, U.S.-European relations since the onset or the preparations for the Iraq invasion in 2003. This brings us back to a point that's been made by Stephen, and certainly will become by others, to what extent this Kiev affair bears on U.S. security. First of all, undermines U.S. security relations with its allies. While the American media met the Minsk II Accords with great skepticism, within Europe a very different note was sounded. Merkel and Hollande were dubbed the continent's diplomatic dream team, and there was talk of nominating Merkel for the Nobel Peace Prize. I met with the top leadership of Die Linke in the Bundestag 3 weeks ago, as I mentioned to you. Off the record, they said they spoke very warm words about Merkel's actions. The same people who had attacked her for being an American puppet in December now found her actions to be quite praiseworthy, though they couldn't say this publicly. Now finally, I'd like to bring to your attention the very latest development in Merkel's foreign and security policies, which many find puzzling, and few people have drawn into relationship with the other issues that I've discussed so far. A couple of weeks ago, the European Commission President, Juncker, issued a call for the creation of a European army, calling it the best way to stand up to Russia. There can be no doubt that Angela Merkel was behind this initiative. After all, Juncker's only past claim to attention was his skillful defense of the euro against its structural weaknesses. Foreign policy was not his forte. Now, why push for a European defense union, for a European army now? It's not a signal to Moscow, but a signal to Washington that Germany will not be bullied over its independent Ukraine policy, will not snap to attention and join an anti-Russian military crusade. I stress military crusade because the anti-Russian actions that Merkel has given her support to were economic. One thing is clear, that whatever is driving German and through Germany European policy on Ukraine and Russia today has a life of its own and is not subservient to Washington. How to make sense of this? I tried to look at the economics. I've already told you that in the dialogue and discussions about the Ukraine crisis, people have pointed to Germany's likelihood to own up its 300,000 jobs on the line. However, when you look a little bit closer, other things come out. That is Germany's relationship with its immediate neighbors in the EU, the former Warsaw Pact countries, most prominently Poland. It's not arbitrary or by chance that Donald Tusk was chosen by Merkel to this very prestigious and high visibility post as the head of the European Council. Okay. I looked at the benefit that Germany enjoys from its near-colonial relationship with Poland, the Czech Republic, and the other former Warsaw Pact states that are now in the EU, and it supplied Germany through its own manufacturing subsidiaries or subcontractors in these countries with very cheap parts and sub-assemblies, all of which goes to further the German export economy, which is the driver of the German economy. I won't go into further details. I'll stop right here. I just want to make the point that we didn't get into this mess with Russia over Ukraine by ourselves. There's been outside force, the European Union, with Germany at its center and pulling many of the strings that helped us get into the mess, and that Germany is now a factor in getting out of the mess if we are going to extract ourselves. If we do that with Germany's help, it will not be by the policy of Angela Merkel. It will be by those who are resisting Merkel within Germany, just as they are resisting Germany outside from Syriza and Greece on the austerity program. So those who are resisting her sanctions policy within the EU, and there were 2, 4, 6, now there are more like a dozen out of the 27 countries that would like to scale back, if not end, the sanctions. That is where you want to watch very closely, because that is the possibility, without counting additional noses on the hill, of finding a solution to the present impasse.
Okay, this was like a European perspective, which is important. We are waiting now for gentleman to turn off the lights. He promised to do it because, okay. Okay. Charlie. Is Charles, you know how to? Okay, I'll try to. Anyway, while they're setting up this screen, just, you know how to find this one?
You can turn on the slides. Oh, no, not yet.
Okay.
All right, that's not.
Anyway, the two issues, not only Ukraine, which are damaging U.S.-Russia relations. Second, I think most important after Ukraine, it's missile defense. And we know that Russia is strongly objecting to that. U.S. is definitely going to do it. And I, for one, when the first talk about missile defense started, I think during the Bush administration, there was the idea that probably the best way to do it is for U.S. and Russia work together. And this exactly was at the time when relations were not so bad. And indeed, as I mentioned already, Russia kept asking, at some point even wanted to be a member of NATO. During the first term of President Yeltsin, when all the what we call pro-Western democracy people run the country, they hinted that Russia wants to join NATO. Well, this was dismissed. So second thing was maybe on missile defense we can work together. And I kind of took some initiative and went to Moscow and get an appointment with Russian Secretary of Defense or Minister of Defense. And he was really said that this is a good idea, but I don't believe the Americans would allow us to do it because it's very sensitive technology and it's not going to work. But if US will tell us, yes, we will definitely cooperate. And this will be probably the greatest thing on earth from my point of view if Russia and US work together on missile defense. But it didn't happen, but this is another very dangerous issue between two countries. Now, Ted Postel, who is a professor, distinguished professor at MIT, and he was for many years advisor to US Secretary of Defense, has different opinion on that, so maybe this is a time for him to say a few words. Ted, please.
Thanks very much, Ed. First, let me say that I'm actually not going to talk about missile defense here, although it is a very important subject, and Ed has heard me speak about it. I really want to focus on the setup, the very nice setup that both Steve and Gil created by talking about the political environment that is so problematic today. What I will focus on, though, is a narrow set of technical issues that are strongly influenced by the downward spiraling political tensions between Russia and the United States. My main point is that whatever the sources of these political tensions are, there are changing technical conditions that are producing a progressively greater danger of an accidental nuclear war between the United States and Russia. As will be explained shortly, there are good reasons to believe that the chances of an accidental nuclear war are now higher than they have been at most times during the Cold War. So that's an important statement. Independent of our current political differences, a failure by Russia and the United States to solve this problem could well result in the most consequential political failure in human history. So this is not minor stuff. The first of the technical problems that are greatly increasing the chances of a nuclear forces accident has to do with the fragility of Russia's early warning system. This point needs to be clearly understood by every U.S. policymaker, and I'm glad to see we have some young military officers here, need to be understood by these military officers as well. Failing to understand it could put the country in grave danger. The Russians have an extremely fragile early warning system. Unlike the United States, they have been unable to build a working space-based early warning system. The lack of a capable Russian space-based early warning system almost certainly poses one of the greatest dangers of nuclear use currently facing the United States. The leadership of the U.S. government was told about this problem in the late 1990s by my group at MIT. You're not the only one who has been frustrated talking to brick walls. In spite of the severe dangers posed by this situation to both Russia and the United States, there was and has been no substantial effort to address this problem. The ability to see the launch of ballistic missiles from space makes it possible to have the longest warning time of ballistic missile attack that is possible. It is a general misconception that this is the most important contribution to U.S. security that these systems make. This is actually not true. The most important contribution that these systems make is to provide general information about the launch of ballistic missiles on a global scale. The only country in the world that has some capability to destroy parts of U.S. nuclear strike forces is Russia. Any attack from Russia would have to be highly coordinated and executed in a massive way. Our current space early warning systems make it possible within less than a minute, these are the newer systems now, to know whether such a strike is underway. Unlike the US, the Russians have no space-based early warning system of this type, and they can only observe events with radars. Radars are limited to line of sight, and since the Earth is round, the line of sight severely limits what these radars can see. This radar line of sight limitation was exactly what led to a false alert of the Russian early warning system in 1995. This false alert was explained by the group at MIT. So those of you who have intelligence clearances, you ought to wonder what happened here to what our own people were doing. The character of that false alert made it appear that the United States might have been making what's called a nuclear precursor attack against Russia. At the time of this potential precursor attack, there was no tension between Russia and the United States. However, because the Russians could not see over the horizon, they had to guess that what they were observing was not what it appeared to be. In such an event, if such an event occurred today, especially if there were an intensified crisis over Crimea, Ukraine, or whatever, the assessment of Russian military and political leaders that no attack was underway would be much more difficult to settle on. The second extremely dangerous technical trend is the relentless preoccupation by US and Russian nuclear war planners to increase the warfighting capacities of their nuclear forces. In particular, the US is making spectacular progress in its unremitting decades of efforts to obtain ever greater accuracy in delivering nuclear warheads. The US Nuclear Forces Modernization Program is aimed at doing everything possible to increase the killing power of US nuclear warheads against Russian silo-based missiles and command centers. Just recently, the program replaced the fuses in 500 of the 768 Trident 100 kiloton submarine warheads. This fuse replacement, we're not talking a guidance system, we're talking about a fuse, gives each of these warheads the same silo killing power desired by US planners as 2 or 3 of these warheads would have otherwise. Vast increase in the killing power. The result 10 to 20% of these modernized warheads can now destroy roughly 70% of Russian silo-based warheads. These same modernized U.S. warheads comprise about 5% of the total number of nuclear weapons that could be delivered by remaining U.S. nuclear weapons. This, of course, assumes that the Russians would not launch their forces in response. So think about that early warning system again. One can be sure that the Russian military is closely following this U.S. technical development. In fact, I have, those who are interested, I've had personal discussions with Viktor Yesin, who was a former commander of the Strategic Rocket Forces, about analysis that's underway in Russia. One can also be assured that the products of the analysis by the Russian military are being sent up to the highest levels of the Russian government. In particular, Russia now has a leader who has a very substantial background in security matters. So we now have a situation where the political relationship has spiraled downward. The U.S. relentless preoccupation with building nuclear warfighting machines is well analyzed and understood by Russian political leaders. And the Russian early warning system is wholly inadequate for providing the kind of reliable and unambiguous data that could assure Russian leaders that they are not under attack in certain ambiguous situations. Hence, I conclude that the chances of an accident that could lead to the launch of Russian nuclear forces is now at least as likely as it was during the Cold War. The question is, why is the U.S. undermining its own security with this dangerous and counterproductive program? The reason is that U.S. nuclear warfighters incorrectly treat nuclear weapons as if they can be used as instruments of conventional warfare. This conventionalization of nuclear war planning is derived from the profoundly false belief that a nuclear war could have military and political objectives no different from that of a conventional war. In conventional war, each adversary tries to take advantage of confusion and chaos to isolate and destroy an enemy's forces piece by piece. By concentrating superior forces against weaker enemy forces, one can destroy the enemy forces so quickly that they cannot do nearly as much damage in return. In order to achieve this, military planners try to find ways to concentrate their forces so that they can locally have numerical and firepower superiority. This is achieved by paralyzing the enemy with attacks on command and control nodes, bridges, railheads, and the like. Anybody who studies warfare sees this all the time. This paralysis then makes it possible for a skillfully commanded military to crush an equally capable enemy by destroying it piece by piece. Now we're going to have the trouble, and we're trying to put the first slide up. Someone has to turn on the projection. Is anybody awake in the projection booth? We are under attack. We need the information.
I see slides on the screen, but
Yeah, there's slides on the screen.
I don't know how to put them on.
Yeah. We're real people here. They're people who get paid money. You know, I'm a big capitalist. I get paid salaries to do this. All right.
Does anyone know?
All right, I'm gonna go on.
A word picture.
What?
A word picture.
I'll give you a word picture. What I have, actually, why don't you hand out these slides to the audience? Me as well, just in case. Pass these around. Okay, what the first slide shows is an aerial view of the Washington, D.C. area with little circles around many, many areas of interest that you might call targets. This figure, it's just a matter of I was afraid. So what I'm basically showing you is an American warfighting plan, how an American warfighting plan might look if projected onto Washington, D.C. with Russian weapons. Well, that's not but that's a step. There we go. Very good, wonderful.
Where are we at?
It's good we have a woman engineer here. That's good enough, that's good enough, that's okay.
Thank you.
Let's see, where are we? We would be up in this area here, where the Senate, there's a third little circle up there. And we're a very hard target for those of you who are interested, because there are all kinds of underground tunnels here, and we have all kinds of command set up, and the potential adversary doesn't know what we might be able to do from these command shelters. You probably know that there's the Russian subway system, and it's a real problem. Okay, this slide shows how U.S. nuclear warfighter would treat nuclear weapons as instruments of conventional warfare, and how they might think about a target area like Washington. So I've chosen Washington. I'm assuming the tactics of an American nuclear warfighter, it's the same as the Russian counterpart, but I'm just, and using Russian weapons just to give you a little feel for how things work. The warfighter would first identify and destroy targets that are important for paralyzing the enemy's ability to fight. An important aim of the nuclear war plan is to destroy various targets, which are very hard to blast effects. This is why targets need to be specifically identified and often attacked with individual nuclear warheads. I mean, this target might be 10,000 psi hard because there are all these underground structures that could be used for leadership activities. Since a number of the warheads can be expected to fail during flight, there may be additional warheads targeted for redundancy. All in all, it's easy to see how a large number of warheads could be needed. To give you a concrete example anchored in history, Hiroshima was destroyed by a single nuclear weapon that had a yield of roughly 12.5 kilotons. In 1960, the science advisor to President Eisenhower, then George Kistiakowsky, told the president about how the U.S. was targeting a Russian city of about the same size as Hiroshima. At that time, the nuclear war plans called for a single 4.5 megaton bomb followed by 3 1.1 megaton bombs. That is to say, the war plan committed 7,500 kilotons to an attack on a city that had been destroyed only 15 years earlier by a single 12.5 kiloton weapon. Now you understand what the term overkill means. So today, the U.S. has constructed a commanding capability to destroy very large parts of Russian nuclear forces, provided, of course, that the Russians don't launch those forces before our forces arrive. This is not the kind of competition that really seems to be in the interest of either side. Could I just please have the next slide? Just there, the one up there. Okay, that's right, the first slide up there. This slide and three others that will follow are aimed at showing you the actual physical scale of the effects of a single nuclear explosion. These slides will show that the attacks involving dozens of nuclear warheads, as this plan that I laid out for you earlier, on a single target area could never achieve the mythical political goals sought in a conventional war. After all, in a conventional war, there are many types of political goals you can have. The two horizontal yellow lines at about 1 mile above the Washington Monument, you can see those there pointed to. They show you the accuracy of the Trident submarine warheads with the old fuse, the non-modernized fuse, which is about 300 feet CEP in the language of targeteers, and about 200 feet for warheads using the new modernized fuse. The next slide, which is shown down here, shows you what's called the fireball, 1 second after the detonation of a single 800 kiloton Russian SS-18 warhead at 1 mile above the Washington Monument. The SS-18 carries 10 of these warheads, just for those of you. The fireball is simply a bubble of superheated air created by the energy deposited into the surrounding air by the nuclear explosion. It is roughly 1 mile in diameter, and it is radiating light and heat at a rate roughly 2 to 3 times that of the equivalent surface area of the sun. Unlike the sun, which is 90 million miles away, this thing is only a mile or two off the ground. The amount of light and heat from the fireball is so gigantic that it will initially shatter stone surfaces into dust, melt and evaporate metal and road surfaces, and essentially set combustible materials on fire within a range of 6 or 7 miles of the detonation point. These fires will quickly coalesce into a firestorm more intense than those that destroyed Hamburg, Dresden, and Hiroshima during World War II. The main difference between those firestorms and this firestorm is that those firestorms were roughly 5 square miles in size each. This firestorm would cover 100 to 150 square miles. This is one weapon. In the next slide, let me just, oh, there you go. Familiar mushroom cloud. This is about 30 to 40 seconds after the fireball shown previously. The fireball initially expands, acting like a fast-moving piston on the surrounding air. And it compresses the air, the surrounding air, and that air propagates outward as a shock wave. When the shock wave reaches the ground, we're looking at this after the shock wave has reached the ground and passed, a secondary shock is created and by reflection off the ground, and you have a gigantic pressure wave and gigantic winds that knock down structures and lift large amounts of debris into the air. You can see this debris carried into the air in the form of the pedestal that you see on the bottom there. So these are the effects associated with a single nuclear explosion, which again should raise the question among those of us who are both civil and those of us who are military planners like myself. Why do we need all this accuracy? We need the accuracy because the U.S. Force Modernization Program is almost solely aimed at making it more feasible for warfighters to use hundreds or thousands of nuclear warheads to fight and win imagined nuclear wars. If this has the appearance of being completely insane and disconnected from any plausible reality, I think I've achieved my goal here today, and I'll stop. Thank you.
Well, we have time for a few questions, please. Do we have a microphone here? No? Okay, then whoever wants to ask questions have to come here. Anyone brave enough? Yeah. Yes, please. Yeah.
We talked about spheres of influence. I'll acknowledge that maybe the United States has spheres of influence in Western Eastern Europe through NATO. Do you not acknowledge the difference between NATO, which is a voluntary association of countries, and Russia's sphere of influence, which largely consists of bullying, intimidating, blackmailing, and invading its neighbors? Is there not a qualitative difference between those two types of spheres of influence?
We have to deconstruct your question because it contains a number of assumptions or assertions. Is it your opinion that there's not a single country allied with Russia that does not do so voluntarily?
Belarus, which is a dictatorship. Kazakhstan, which is a dictatorship.
And of course, this is the infertile debate is so's your old man, but there are so many counterexamples. Our allies include all the Gulf countries, which are all dictatorships. Good. I don't agree that NATO should be a voluntary organization. I'm going to change your question a little bit. It said that any country that qualifies by NATO's own criteria to join NATO should be permitted to be a NATO member. You'd agree with that. And we'd also agree that at the moment Ukraine does not qualify, nor does Georgia, doesn't control its own territories, all the rest. But let's just say it did. I disagree because the original intent of NATO has been lost. When NATO was created, it was not created to be a sorority or a fraternity or the Junior Chamber of Commerce, where if you paid your dues, you got to be a member. It was created to be a security organization. And if you're faithful to the idea of a security organization, then the only criterion is, does the admission of an additional country increase, enhance the security of the other members of the organization? And we now have 20 years of evidence that this has not been the case with NATO expansion. I'll make the argument somewhat simplistic, but generally valid. The Ukrainian crisis, which is the worst of our times and carries all the risks that Professor Postel graphically demonstrates, is a direct outcome of the decision to expand NATO. So we have before us, during the last 18 months or so, 15 months, ample evidence of the insecurity creating of reckless NATO expansion. Now, that would not be true of every country that was given membership since the end of the 1970s. But I would argue that it certainly includes bringing in the 3 small Baltic states. It certainly includes the backdoor attempt to bring Georgia into NATO in 2008. And if you read very carefully, the EU, the European Union Trade Partnership Agreement offered to Kiev, it's about 1,000 pages. There is a section called Military and Security Issues. And though NATO is not mentioned, it clearly obliged Ukraine, had Yanukovych sign that document, to abide by NATO policy. That is a provocation, not a building of security. So the answer to your question is, let's stick with the issue of security. And if we stick to that issue, this Pac-Man-like gobbling up of every country between West Germany and Russia has certainly gravely decreased American security. And the final point is, the one I made at the end of my talk, American national security is not possible without a partner in the Kremlin. Not a friend, a partner. And we have lost the Kremlin as a partner, possibly for a generation. So our security is greatly diminished by the expansion of our voluntary democratic NATO organization. That's my own position. But I think the evidence is in front of us.
Good. Okay. I'm not steeped in the political traditions of Gilbert and Steve, but I have worked in the Pentagon and I've worked on military matters. And I have a question that could be, because we can get into historical details and those are important, but the world we inherit is not always a just world for all kinds of reasons. So let me just give you a not an exact analogy, but something that is worthy of careful thought. If we imagine that Russia, or let's take the Soviet Union at its peak of power, approached the governments of Venezuela, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Panama, and maybe even Mexico. That's a little more stretched. And they said, we'll sell you weapons. And by the way, if you get into trouble with the Americans or anyone else, we're going to form some kind of treaty alliance. Now, first of all, it would be a stupid thing to do, because what I would say, I'd go down to these guys over here and I'd say, we're here, they're not, let's go kick them out. Because we have the military force, we're in the local area, and we don't want these guys in our area of influence. And what happened in Russia, in some sense, this is not an expression of support, but what Putin very intelligently did is he said, we're here and you're not. And this is important to us, and you're just talking. And so we're going to come in and do something. Again, I'm not arguing this is a good thing or is justified in a historical way. But I think to get involved in these arguments about what exactly the analogy is losing the big picture, which is simply that these great countries, and Russia is a great country, just as the United States is, have concerns about their borders and border states. And to start, I was against NATO expansion for very simple, so I thought it was politically a stupid thing to do, to be frank. But I was also against it because I don't like the idea of making military commitments that we can't meet. You know, if Russia was stupid enough, and I don't think they're that stupid, to decide they're going to kick down the door and walk into the Baltic states or Poland, there's nothing we could do about it, and there was nothing we could have done about it. So what are we doing making these commitments? It's no different than making the commitment to these poor Kurds that there's going to be a no-fly zone over, you know, after the war of 1991, and then letting Saddam Hussein just murder these people mercilessly, and the Shiites also in the south. If you make a commitment, keep it. And if you make a commitment, be prepared to have the forces there to do it. So I'm not against military force at all, but I am also against I'm against sending our people out to get murdered for nothing. I don't like it. I think these people do great service for the country. I don't want to see them shot up for things that aren't really important to us. And I'm also for doing it right if we need to do it. But I just have a lot of trouble with all these different slicing arguments.
Well, we run out of time. We will have some time for questions because no, we are not allowed to use this room longer than what we're allowed to do. But just on the NATO thing, yeah, NATO is expanding, it's a fact, but was it really successful? Today, this morning, horrible news came from Yemen. And this is another country in a row. So we're talking about Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Ukraine, now Yemen. Where is NATO? NATO was supposed to keep security. Why we are paying all those huge, you know, our taxpayers' money, because most of the money for NATO comes from US. So did NATO did any good job? Any example of NATO doing a good job in Afghanistan or Iraq or whatever? So the only thing that's successful is raising money and asking for more. Every time more and more and more funds, but where's the results? And today on the Fox News, which is not really, you know, the best, you know, I mean, the paper, newsworthy channel, they say that we are actually a disaster. We are facing a disaster for US in the Middle East in all those countries. And I wish that all the money we spend on NATO could help us. So far, the only thing they talk about expansion and raising more money. Anyway, we have a small break to make because you know, people some have to take whatever. And let's come back in about 10 minutes and we will continue this. Thank you. They don't allow it. They don't allow it.